Hope you've had a good week so far. Safe, protected. I suppose you have, or you're here at least, if we hadn't had major accidents. That's something to be considered. I know Brother Gene drives a lot, and I drive quite a bit. Some of the rest of you drive quite a bit, and you pray that things will go safely, and then you come in the afternoons and you've had a safe day. There are things to be thankful for. In our readings, I'm just going to make a quick comment. The reading that Josh had before our hearing in Genesis 25, the births of who are mentioned there? Jacob and Esau. Who was the firstborn? Esau. But who would serve the other? The older would serve the younger, and that happened. The descendants of Esau would become who? Edomites. The Edomites. And I think also, as Josh was reading, isn't it fascinating? That's the poorest word that's best I think of. Fascinating how when Moses is recording of all the events he could have recorded, he records that little incident where they grow up, and who wants the kind of let's see, let me rephrase it. Who doesn't mind about the giving his birthright to his brother? Who doesn't mind about that? Yeah, Esau. He had the right of primogeniture since he was firstborn, and so he sold it for what? A bowl of soup. And isn't it interesting that here's something great he has, and then just or somebody said it could have been some really good stew, but not that, wouldn't have been that much. And isn't it fascinating that here Moses just records that, and then in Hebrews 12 he says, don't be a profane person or a fornicator as Esau was, who for one mess of meat sold his birthright. And he makes the point, you are the firstborn one. You have these special privileges. You're the church of the firstborn. You have all these great privileges, and don't give that up to go back into Judaism, or give it up, period. Moses just happened to write that, right? When you look back and you make those comparisons of what you read in the Old Testament and how it's used in the New, and you think, well, I wonder why Moses wrote that. Well, it's almost like God had all that in mind. He used that as an example. Had Moses, of all the things Moses could have written, kind of like, the Melchizedek meeting with Abraham, 3 verses. Why? The only way you can really explain that is there was a divine hand behind all of it, and that was God inspiring it. But just a quick thought. Now, in our readings, we are covering quite a bit of ground in 2 Chronicles chapter. We're on Numbers 133, 34, 35, and 36. That would be Sunday through today, and that's 2 Chronicles 9 through 2 Chronicles 24. A lot is happening in these chapters. 2 Chronicles 9, who is still king at this point? Solomon. And Solomon, there are things that show the great wealth of Solomon. I think it interesting. Who comes to? Well, before we get that, notice in verse. Let's go back to where I was. Who comes to visit him? The Queen of Sheba, and you'll notice that she sees, his food, his servants, the apparel. There's no more spirit. It's just like, wow. That's in the end of verse 4. And she says, I couldn't believe what had been told about you until, I saw it from my own eyes. And even now, the half of thy greatness was not told me. That's in verse 6. And look how much she gives him of gold in verse 9. How many talents? 100 and how much? 120. Yeah, 120 talents. A talent, remember, is roughly 70 pounds. You do the math, 7 times 12 is 84. That's about 8,400 pounds Do the math on that, Will, and that's how many tons? 8,400. Ton is, everybody knows a ton is how many pounds?
2,000.
2,000 pounds, so over 4 tons of gold. And then if you'll notice down in verse 13, now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year, this is just from a lot of places, 666 talents. That's 666 times 70 is 46,620 pounds. It's just mind-boggling, the kind of wealth that Solomon had. He, over in verse 26, he ruled over all the kings from the river, even into the land of the Philistines and the border of Egypt. That shows that, during Solomon's reign, the geographical boundaries had been expanded to what really the extended land promise given to Abraham in Genesis 15 indicated, from the river Euphrates to the river of Egypt. And so they subjugated, not that they always lived in that area, but they subjugated. However, in verse 27, the king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones, and cedars made he to be as a sycamore trees that are in the look. And they brought horses for Solomon out of Egypt and for all the lands. All this gold, and then silver, and then horses. And what does that remind us? Is that good? No. Keep your finger there real quickly. Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17 is an important passage because here the king is reminded, or actually Israel is reminded, God says when you get in the land, you'll want a king to be like people around about you. And I'll give you a king, but here are some limitations, some prohibitions. Verse 16, don't do what? Don't multiply horses. Don't the people go down into Egypt. Verse 17, don't multiply wives. And then don't multiply at the end of the verse silver and gold. The very things that the kings were warned not to do, Solomon did. All right, so let's go back now real quickly. 2 Chronicles 9. Solomon ends up dying. How long had he reigned? Verse 30? 40 years. And he was buried in the city of David. And then who begins the reign after it? Rehoboam. And then in chapter 10, Rehoboam, we learn a little bit more in 1 Kings. Rehoboam wanted to make the people's work harder or easier? Harder. And he listened to the counsel of those who were his contemporaries rather than older men. As a result of that, the people, it was a backlash. And the people, and then who was the opportunist who said, just follow me and we'll be better off? Jeroboam. And so Chronicles now follows the, what's going on in the southern kingdom and the priests, and whereas Kings dealt with both. And so we're not following really what Jeroboam is doing, but Rehoboam. In a nutshell, Rehoboam allowed Shishak, an Egyptian, to come in, and what happened? All that gold and bucklers or shields that Solomon had made, what happens? They're gone. Yeah. So Shishak invades, and then we have Rehoboam death. So as Solomon's death, then Rehoboam, and then who follows Rehoboam? Chapter 13, verse 1. Abijah. And Abijah wars with Jeroboam in chapter 13. And then Abijah dies, and who reigns following him? Asa. So you got Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa. And then in chapters 14, 15, and 16, in essence, what kind of a king was Asa? Good, bad, indifferent? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Asa was good.
Well, Asa was a good king, but was he always on the right? He wasn't. And even in the end of his life, in 16th chapter, there's not whether some things that mention that he didn't listen to a prophet, and then somehow he was diseased in his feet. I'm looking at verse 12 of chapter 16. And we don't know the details, but what he did not do was, he didn't go to whom? He didn't go to the Lord, but to the physicians. And that's stated in kind of a condemning way. And so he slept with his fathers. He died. And then who follows Asa? Who? Jehoshaphat. Yes, Jehoshaphat. And then he reigns. And then in chapter 18, we have, it continues on. And then, let's see, down to, chapter 19, continues in 20. He fights with Ahab, and then against the Moabites and the Ammonites. And then eventually in chapter 21, he dies, and who follows him? Jehoram. All right? And then Jehoram dies, and who reigns? Ahaziah. And then who comes into the scene that is from the northern Athaliah. Yes. And then we have the reign of Athaliah. What kind of a lady was she? About as evil as it gets, even killing off some of her grandsons. And
with her mother,
yes.
Jezebel.
Yes, yes. And so you've got that bad training all the way through. And yet there's a little son who is kept in the providence of God from her murderous ways. His name is Joash, right. And so he is eventually crowned in chapter 24. He's 7 years old when he began to reign. He's a co-regent. He reigned for 40 years. And a lot of good things he did are mentioned there in chapter 24. All right. We'll stop there, and because we want to go on into try to finish the speech on the Mount of Olives relative to Jerusalem's destruction. Comment, question on any of this reading in 2 Chronicles? Okay, let's move over to Matthew 24, and we've not really gone into Mark and Luke's account very much. Matthew is the more exhaustive account, and you read Matthew and you read pretty much Mark and Luke as well. By the way, I wanted to. I'm not going to show all the pictures of Jerusalem. Just want to come right to where we are. In our study through the life of Jesus, we want to remember where we've been. We're in the last week, or technically the last 10 days, Friday to Sunday. And keep in mind, what we really do want to remember, as much as possible, we want to remember what the major events that happen each day. He arrives from Jericho to Bethany, which is just not quite 2 miles from Jerusalem. And on Friday, he observes the Sabbath that night. He rests on the Sabbath, and then he goes to Simon's house where he's anointed. And then the day of triumph on Sunday, authority is shown by cursing the fig tree, cleansing the temple. And then Tuesday, we have all of this. The first thing happens on Tuesday, he comes in, the Pharisees said, who, by what authority doest thou these things? Who gave you this authority? He answers that. And then we have the authority challenge, the 3 warning parables, the entrapment with the Pharisee and the Herodian about is it lawful to give tribute, and then the Sadducean question, then what think you of the Christ, whose son is he? Then the woes in the 23rd chapter of Matthew against the scribes and Pharisees, the widow's mites in contrast, and then where we are now here in the discourses concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. So they've come out. As they're coming out, the disciples call attention to what? The buildings of the temple. They come down, obviously, in the Kidron. They come up on the mountain. They sit down. And you can imagine you've been driving, been walking for a while. You're going uphill, so they sit down and rest. 4 of the disciples are mentioned specifically in Mark's account. And they ask him privately the questions that pose the foundation of this speech. Who are the 4 disciples? Yeah, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Was that you, David, said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? That reminds me, well, I better not go. something we had in our family about something similar to that. So anyway, Peter, Andrew, James, and John asked him privately, and they're looking over, and so we have the speech now that Jesus says. And the question, according to Matthew, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? I wanted to read to you something that Brother Bowles, H. Leo Bowles, y'all never heard him preach, did you? He was I was trying to think. I bet Sister Violet heard him preach. I think he died around in the 50s, but he preached in Birmingham. He preached at Inslee. He was a contemporary of Brother Lewis's and had sat at the feet of David Lipscomb. But I wanted to read to you, if I can find it real quickly. Here we go. I wanted to read to you something that he said that I thought that was really good. This actually is a comment he made on the fig tree down in verses 32 through 35. He says, as the swelling buds and leaves of the fig tree indicate the near approach of summer, so when Jerusalem is destroyed, you may know that God's judgment is sure and swift and will be as certain in the last day. This destruction would come upon Jerusalem during the lifetime of some who were present before that generation passes away. This means that there would be some people living who would see the awful destruction pronounced against Jerusalem. This destruction is a type of the destruction of the final, incorrigible wicked. Now, here that leads into this, and I have marked all this. Often, prophetic language has a double significance. Jehovah told Adam that he would die in the day that he ate the forbidden fruit, Genesis 2:7. Yet Adam lived 930 years. There was a primary fulfillment of this when Adam was separated from the Garden of Eden, and a secondary fulfillment of it in his death. Isaiah foretold the birth of Jesus from a virgin, yet added a prophecy which confines it to his own generation, Isaiah 7:14 through 17. The prophet combined type and antitype in the same words. David spoke of the Messiah under the type of Solomon. Words and events, new kingdoms and dynasties are the prophetic alphabet for spelling out the divine plan. So the destruction of Jerusalem becomes the type of the final judgment and destruction. Sometimes it is difficult to take the language of Jesus and apply it to both the type and antitype. God's word is sure, and those things which seem to be changeless, that's what his comment there is on heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. He says, God's word is sure, and those things which seem to be changeless and eternal will fail. But not one word of what Jesus told would fail of accomplishment. He made the point about the type and antitype, and sometimes both are mixed together. And I think we have some of that here in Matthew 24. Jerusalem's destruction would be a foretaste of what? Final judgment, yes. Okay, so here we are. When shall these things be? That is not one stone standing upon another. And what shall be the sign of thy coming? Now and then the end of the world. They thought the end of the world would be when the destruction of Jerusalem was. But quite frankly, what shall be the sign of thy coming? Could you truthfully say, in the prophetic language of the Old Testament as well as Jesus' language, that Jesus did come in judgment, the sign of your coming in judgment on Jerusalem? Could you say that? Yes. Oftentimes the Lord comes in judgment by using various nations on his people. And I think in that sense that Jesus came in judgment on, but he also will come at the end of the world. And I think that's where verse 36, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, neither the angels of heaven or the Son, the Father only. That changes gears to the last day when he comes at the end of time. So here's where we are. We've been going through he said, it's interesting, we point out Sunday morning, when they said, what will be the sign of thy coming in the end of the world? The first thing he says is, take heed that you be not led astray, because there are going to be false Christs coming, wars, other calamities affecting the Jews. the sufferings and successes of the disciples as the gospel would be preached. In fact, he says, if you'll notice there, in Matthew 24, verse 14, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a testimony to all the nations, then shall the end come." Well, in preaching the gospel, people, Peter and the others, and we preach that Jesus is now where? In heaven, at God's right hand, as our king, as well as our priest. So, in a sense, one thing I wanted to show you real quickly. It's interesting here when he talks about, if I can come back, you turn over to Matthew the 26th chapter, Matthew 26. Jesus is on trial before Pilate, and I didn't mark this. I think I can find it. Here we go. In verse 64. I'm sorry, not Pilate. This is before Caiaphas. Verse 64, Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said, nevertheless I say unto you, Jesus says, henceforth ye shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Here, the Jewish leadership rejected Jesus as their king. And so Jesus is saying, you're rejecting me now, but one day soon the tables will be turned, and I'll be sitting in judgment over you, and you will see the Son of Man coming with power. Well, they would see that in the destruction of Jerusalem. If you look back in chapter 24, do you see the passage that's very similar to that? Yes, verse 30. Thank you. I didn't mark it. Thank you, Randy. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And I take it that little paragraph, 29 through 31, is speaking figuratively of the destruction of Jerusalem. He's been telling in physical terms what to expect, what to hope for, that your flight not be on the Sabbath, not be in the winter, not having women nursing children, and so on. But then he mentions in 29 through 31 this highly figurative language to describe all of this, and it shows the Lord coming in judgment as Randy mentioned, on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. We'll get to that in a moment. All right, we got down to page 81, wasn't it? What number?
It's top 81.
Top of 81. Okay. Let's again, what we've covered so far, we've had the false signs, the true signs. Tribulation would be terrible during those days. Expect no deliverance. And then let's read 29 through 31. Richard, if you would.
Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great shout of the trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
Yeah. Now, let's, instead of going to the notes, keep reading. Now, from the fig tree, learn a parable. When a branch is now become tender, put forth its leaves, ye know that the summer is nigh. Even so ye also, when ye see all these things, know ye that he is nigh, even at the doors, that the Lord is here in judgment. Verily I say to you, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be accomplished. Now, admittedly, verses 29 through 31 give a whole lot of commentators a lot of consternation, because it's difficult to see when he says especially, but after those days, what days? What's he talking about? It looks like, but immediately after, all of these false signs and then the true signs occur, then comes the end. That's what best I can tell. And even if you can't put it all together, I think the bookend to all of this is down in verse 34. That whatever he's talking about has to occur during what? That generation. And so it looks like to me that verses 29 through 31 have a very highly prophetic, sweeping imagery of the sun will not give its light, the moon will be turned into blood, and all this government is going to fall. And that's how it's used, as we note on our stuff. And yet all that's going to be done within that generation. However, as he mentioned in 35, it's certain, as stable as heaven and earth are, he says they'll pass away, but not my words. My words are more stable than heavens and earth. But of that day and hour knoweth no one. Notice, I don't know if you can see, I highlighted in red all these times the day, the word days, and the word know. You can know. And then down here in verse 32, ye know that the summer is nigh. Verse 33, you see all these things, know ye that the Son of Man is at the door. But then look at verse 36. But of that day and hour knoweth what? No one. Look down at verse 38. As in the days which were before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they knew not. They knew not. Verse 42, watch therefore, for ye know not on what day your Lord comes. But know this, that if the master of the house had known, he would have known what to do. But be ready, because, verse 44, an hour you think not, the Son of Man comes. You see, there's a tremendous contrast, I see, between these things that you can know. You do know that when the time for the end of Jerusalem, the end of the city, the end of the temple is coming, these things are coming, and you can just bank on it, and you need to get out of the city. But on the other hand, when the Lord comes in final judgment, you can't know anything about it. There aren't going to be any signs. And other passages would show that. And then so the end of Matthew 24 talks about who is the wise steward, the wise servant. Evidently people like the apostles and others, they need to make sure that they're doing right all the time. And then in chapter 25, which is a continuation of the speech, he gives the two parables. Parable of the virgins, 5 foolish, 5 wise. Parable of the talents. And then the third thing is this picture of judgment. And so all of that, especially 25, deals with the last day. I think just to keep that in our mind, just run it back and forth in our minds to keep how the narrative is going is helpful. All right, let's go back in 29 through 31. On my notes here, on page 81, these verses describe in sweeping figurative language the overthrow of Jerusalem and the Jewish state. Jews were very familiar with such figurative language as signifying a judgment of God, an overthrow of government, not final judgment, but a judgment nonetheless. Read the following passages to state to what nation such language applied in the Old Testament. Let's glance at these verses. First of all, you tell me, Isaiah 13, 9 and 10, to what nation did it apply? Babylon. Let's look at it real briefly. Turn over to Isaiah 13. Whoever has it first, I want you to read verses 9 and 10 first, and then go back to verse 1. Isaiah 13, 9 and 10. Whoever has it, read it. 13, 9 and 10.
Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forward, and the moon will not cause its light to shine.
Yes, verse 9 calls this the day of what? the day of the Lord. But then look at this in verse 1 is your answer. Of whom does he speak?
The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw.
Yeah, and the idea of a burden is an oracle against, usually an utterance against the nation. The burden, this heavy load against this country. So that's Babylon. Again, the same kind of language. The stars of heaven, the constellations thereof shall not give their light. Sun shall be darkened in scornful. You remember people have talked about in 1929, in October, when the stock market fell, people say it was a dark day in the United States. Well, it could have been sunshiny, but it was a dark day insofar as, our economy was going under. And a lot of people lost their fortunes, lost their homes, lost their jobs. It was a terrible time in 1929 for our country. And dark days, we've heard that. Or somebody's been really sick with cancer or something. He went through some real gloomy, dark days. Well, it could have been sunshiny, but that's the language of the prophets. Let's go to Ezekiel 32. Same idea, but it's a different country. Let's read verses 6 through 8. Patty, do you have that? Ezekiel 32, 6 through 8. Then we'll go back and read verse 2. All right, same kind of imagery. And in verse 2, of whom does he speak? Pharaoh and Egypt. All right, let's go to Joel. Joel, the 2nd chapter. This gets it a little closer to home. Joel, the 2nd chapter. And then Joel is quoted in Acts 2. Joel 2, 30 and 31. Kirsten, if you would. Joel 2, 30 and 31.
There, you said what now?
Joel 2, 30 and 31. I couldn't hear you, Kirsten. What did you say?
I'm sorry, I said I didn't have it.
Don't have it? Who has it? Farron, you got it?
I got it. And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved.
All right, now stop there. If you go back to verse 28 of the same chapter, it shall come to pass afterward that I'll pour forth of my spirit on all flesh. Everybody in this audience knows, well, that's Peter, Pentecost, Acts 2. And all right, now let's go to Acts 2. And Joel is prophesying that this is going to happen, and Peter nails it. All right, they have been speaking in tongues. There is the miraculous sign of the Holy Spirit, tongues of fire parting asunder. There's a sound as of the rushing of a mighty wind. Some accuse them of being drunk, and Peter said that's not true. Verse 15, we're not drunken as ye suppose, seeing it's the 3rd hour of the day. But this is that which hath been spoken through the prophet Joel. All right, Josh, if you would, Acts 2, pick up the reading 17 through 21. Acts 2, 17 through 21.
Through 21,
Right.
verse 2. And it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood, fire, and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved.
All right, now let's think about let me walk through a narrative here. Here we got the day of Pentecost, where I'm standing right now. Peter says, or Joel had said, behold, the Lord saith that I will pour forth of my Spirit on all flesh. All right, that's happening right now on the day of Pentecost. And as Peter continues on to quote that passage in Joel, he says, now, there will be handmaids and men servants that will be able to prophesy. Well, you see the apostles, and they laid hands on prophets. And so you have the divine revelation is beginning on Pentecost. The new covenant is being articulated, and as time goes. And then he says, but a little bit later, I will show wonders in the heavens above, signs on the earth beneath, blood, fire, vapor, and smoke. Sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall be turned into blood before the day of the Lord come, that great and notable. And all during this time, before that time comes, anybody who calls on the name of the Lord can be saved. What did Joel predict? In the sun will be darkened, the moon will be turned into blood. The overthrow of what? Jerusalem. And so what you can see is that all this time from Pentecost onward, the gospel was being revealed through the apostles and prophets, and all of a sudden, and people were calling on the name of the Lord, that in AD 70, what happened? Jerusalem was destroyed. The day of the Lord came on them. Now, it's true that since that time, we continue on in enjoying the benefits of the gospel. But the point I want to get you to see is that kind of language is highly figurative language of simply an overthrow of the government, whatever government is under discussion. So with what we find in Acts 2, it was not only the overthrow of Jerusalem, but it was the overthrow of God's dealings with the Jews as he had, and the institution of a new kingdom. What kingdom is that? The church. And so you see all of that's rolled into all these figurative expressions in Isaiah concerning Babylon, and Ezekiel concerning Pharaoh, and there are others that are similar to that. And then Joel is speaking of how the gospel would come forth in the last days. And then it's almost like a little narrative that it's going to be continually revealed, and then there's going to come a time when God just shuts it down. As Brother Gene has mentioned, he puts a period at the end of Jerusalem. Is that a copyrighted idea, Brother Gene? It is copyrighted, so I won't be able to use that. But I think that's a great way of putting it. It's just a period. This is the end of my dealings with you as a special religious people, as a physical people, as a kingdom, and I'm replacing it with the church, the kingdom of God. Does that make sense? Isn't it mind-boggling how how Joel could have, had been inspired to write that probably 700-800 years before Christ, and then Peter quotes it, and it's almost like reading the daily newspaper. And these events are happening. So let's go back to Matthew 24.
Brother Phil.
Yes, sir.
Real quick, I got it real quick. God is, of course, he judges people, and some of the nations that he judged so severely, they were wiped out of existence.
Yes.
You just have to wonder, why did he not do the same thing, even to the point where there would be no Jewish anything to this day?
Yeah. Well, there isn't, as far as they can literally trace back. There's really not. I'm convinced there are Jews who have a lineage that goes back, but they can't trace it back. That's the thing. One thing I really wanted to, when I was living in Dallas, Texas, we'd canvass a neighborhood, and I got a class with this fella who was kind of a Pentecostal, and he was in a wheelchair. And Adolphus Guest, I'm sure he's dead now. He was a good bit older than I was then. I was in my mid-20s. And we started studying Acts. And we got to Acts 2. And he made the point on, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall be turned into blood before, and there'll be signs in the heavens above. And he was sure that the SAC, Strategic Air Command, with those high-flying jets and the vapor trails, that's what Peter had reference to. I said, Doc, that couldn't be. I said, Peter says, this is that which was spoken. When Peter says, this is that, then you can take it to the bank. It's not something in the future for us now. It was going on then. And when Peter says, this is that, what you read in Joel is being fulfilled in the words that Peter's talking about. And I just think that's helpful, because oftentimes you get people say, well, I wonder what he's talking about with the sun shall be darkened. Now we've had eclipses, and there have been lunar eclipses, and people go all off the wall, and they forget that we're talking about prophetic language that describes an overthrow of government. Period. That's it. Yes, sir.
On the day that Christ was crucified, though, it turned dark and
Yes.
stayed dark for hours.
3 hours.
And
Yeah.
that wasn't anything to do with overthrow of government.
No, I don't believe so. All right, let's go through our questions here, the notes. On note number 2 on page 81, verse 30, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, likely refers to the fact Jerusalem's destruction was a sign that what Jesus had predicted was true, and that he now reigns in heaven. He had destroyed the city that rejected him. It's tantamount to saying, and then shall appear the sign that the Son. When you read, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, just think the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. He's showing that he is exactly who he claimed to be. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, would likely describe Jews all over the world who were grieved upon hearing of the destruction of their beloved city. And then the next phrase, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, refers to his coming in judgment on the city. When people saw Jerusalem destroyed, they saw Jesus' judgment manifesting his power and glory, or they should have learned it at least. And then in verse 31, likely refers to Jesus manifesting his power, not only in judgment, but also in deliverance of the elect through the preaching of the gospel. Notice he says, he shall send forth his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. That sounds a little bit like the second coming of Christ, doesn't it? About the final judgment. And it could have that kind of intertwined in the meaning, but I mentioned in the note, it was common among prophets to condense in one sweeping figure of speech things which would occur in their own time, as well as things which would have a later fulfillment, which is what I just referred to. When Jesus gave the limited commission, he predicted some things that would occur that found fulfillment only after the Great Commission was given. They'll deliver you up to councils and before Gentiles and in the synagogue. Well, that was a little bit more than what went on during the limited commission. Similarly, though Matthew 24, 29 through 31 is found in the larger context of Jerusalem's destruction, it also has elements that seem to point to its ultimate fulfillment at the end of time, when Jesus returns to judge the whole world. This seems true of verse 31, especially when compared to its parallel in Luke 21, 27. If so, Jerusalem's destruction becomes a true type or shadow of final judgment. And that's exactly what Brother Bowles was alluding to in what we read a while ago. Comment, question? Yes, ma'am.
Since these things took place with Jerusalem at this time, what applications can we use like now for the second coming of Christ?
Yeah. I think the fact in the destruction of Jerusalem, everything was so precise, as Jesus said, that it ought to strengthen our faith that when Jesus says you need to be ready always, watch ye, for you know not on what hour the Lord comes, that we can take that to the bank. Just as he said this would happen and it was terrible, if we're not ready, it can be terrible for us too. It will be terrible for us. And I think that's one. In fact, I've got a chart that I've got several lessons on, but that, in a quick summary of it, Kay, I think that's one thing, that Jesus was telling them exactly what would happen, and to be prepared for it. They could get out and be spared. But the final judgment for us, of which that is a type, we've got to always be prepared for. And I think that's the main point, you know. Somebody else had a hand up, I thought, over here. Yes, sir, Brother Fair.
I can't wrap my head around when it says, and they'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory to judge Jerusalem. I don't think they saw the Son of Man coming. I think they saw Rome coming.
Well, they did, but it would be the Lord through the Romans, just like when Isaiah said that the Lord would come, that the Assyrians would, was it Isaiah 10:10, I think, or 10:5, Ho Assyria, the rod of mine anger. And so God can use other nations to accomplish his chastisement of these other people.
True, but I don't think it ever said he saw God coming through that.
Well, they're not going to see him personally, but that when Jesus said this is going to happen to Jerusalem, and it did, then that is evidence that he was, you know, what he said was right. And in that sense, they would see his status of deity, you know, in that. I think that's the point that he makes there. Yes, sir.
In secular history, is there a time frame that it took in 70 AD for the Romans to actually conquer Jerusalem? Did they lay siege to it and then went in and just destroyed everything, including the temple?
Yeah, and they were thinking about Titus. The point was to Richard's the one to get with on that, but they were thinking about sieging it, and in fact they built all kinds of earthworks around it, hadn't they, Richard? And they built all kinds of earthwork, and we're going to starve it out. And then most think that if they did that, then the repercussions of that would spread to people on past Jerusalem. And so for a while, Titus had Vespasian and others that were circling around, and then he was recalled to Rome, or was being recalled to Rome. And so what he did was, he said, let's just finish this off in a hurry. And so then that corresponds to what Jesus said, except those days be shortened, the elect would not be saved. That he finished it off hurriedly so he could go about his business with Rome, and then that let others who were in the provinces of Samaria and Galilee alone. And that's what you were going to say something, Richard.
He prefaced this whole paragraph from verse 29 with verse 28 with a hint who he was going to use to.
Yeah, the eagles. Yeah,
The eagles represented Rome.
exactly. Yeah, just like the eagle represents the United States, just about, doesn't it? Yeah, wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered. And here's Jerusalem, and the whole Jewish establishment is pictured as a dead or dying carcass, and the eagles are surrounding it, the Roman legions.
You see that with what happened. A few of the zealots escaped Jerusalem and went to Masada, and the Romans followed them down there and besieged Masada. So they were determined to eliminate any rebellion
Yeah.
inside the country.
Yeah, from what I've understood and read, the Jews were, like known cantankerous people, and the Romans had kind of had their fill of them. In the if you think about the whole Roman world, that's their far eastern theater of activity, and let's just mash them and get them over with, you know.
If you live peacefully inside the Roman Empire, the Romans let you do almost what you really
Yeah.
wanted to do. But if you caused rebellion and broke the peace, they were on you like a dog or a tick on the foot of a dog.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, good, real good. Any other comment, Brother Gene? You look like you want to say something.
In one of the parables of this during this week, the scribes and Pharisees got the message, and when it got down to the end, the Lord was going to come back
Yeah.
and deal with these people that had not heard the Son,
Yes.
and they would be done away with. And at the end of that, those scribes and Pharisees, no, that's us. They understood it was
It
them,
was
and
referring to them.
let's not let this happen.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
that can be a message for people who discount the Word of God, and
Yes.
whether Jesus will come back or not. And it won't be a quiet day.
No, that's exactly right. Good point. Yeah, the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew 22, and then the parable of the wicked husbandman, that both of those,
And that
almost
he-
back to back,
You know, he nailed that down to their fault.
Yes, exactly right. All right, we'll have to stop, and Lord willing, we finish up. But in a sense, I don't apologize for us taking a little extra time, because we've been studying about the Jews really since Genesis 12. And this is putting a marked, determined end to them because of their rejection of Jesus Christ. And that all means something to us. Okay.
You said that when Jesus said this, was telling them these things was about 40 years
Before it happened. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, you take AD 20, Jesus died probably around AD 29, and this happened 69, 70.